afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Xavier's Association of Chemistry, popularly known as ZAC, and Chemistry Department, St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, I welcome you all to the Chem Cruise lecture series. I'm very much pleased with the fact that we are opening this series on the occasion of National Science Day celebrations with Professor Anindya Datta from IIT Mumbai. Since its inception in 2003, ZAC has seen many changes in its growth process, but one thing that has remained constant is the students' enthusiasm and commitment towards it. It's their sheer energy that has kept it running through all these years. Without taking any more time, I would like to invite Mr. Marisban Kotwal, Head of Chemistry Department, to share his views and welcome Dr. Datta. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ashma. Good and a warm welcome to one and all for our Science Day celebrations. The Department of Chemistry is glad to have amongst us Dr. Anindya Datta, who is going to share his expertise, knowledge, passion, and enthusiasm science. Welcome, Dr. Anindya Datta. Thank you so much for being with us today on a day that year marks almost 93 years of Dr. C.V. Raman's discovery of Raman effect, which in that era virtually represented finding a needle out of a haystack, keeping in mind the kind of instrumentation and technology available then. Dr. C.V. Raman's research clearly pointed out that human limitation is only a myth. It pointed out that it is the scientific fervor and passion that holds the key to great discoveries and provide a better world to our future generations. However, my dear friends, let me remind you all that celebrating science is a daily requirement. Like your daily bath, for success of human species as a whole depends on constructive scientific discoveries, scientific applications, and conversion of these discoveries into sustainable technology. The threats to survival of human beings has never been so large as just now, and hence each one of us need to imbibe the scientific fervor and remember that science is a way of wise thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. Reason, observation, and experiences are the trinity of science, and they should be the factors governing our lives too. Nothing has such power to broaden the mind as the ability to investigate systematically every aspect of life. And the true science ethos is the ethical use of science for the benefit of our society, which is heavily dependent on science and technology. Let us remember that we do not need guided missiles and misguided human beings. We do not need smartphones and dumb human beings. We do not need artificial intelligence, but we need intelligence governed by compassion and conscience. I leave you all with these thoughts and wish you all a great future dedicated in constructive usage of science for the betterment of our country and the world as a whole. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Ashma ma'am for resurrecting Zach in this particular year, especially during these times when we do not meet students in a face to face setting and we are always with them online. So, thank you, Ashma, for taking up this and also promoting Zach and planning for its future upcoming months. Thank you. Over to Ashma again.
Yeah, thanks a lot, sir. I'll now request Bonobiti to take over the session.
Thank you, Ashma ma'am. Thank you so much. So, hello everyone, and good afternoon, Dr. Datta. I'm so glad that we all could get here together for Zach's very first event this year, Chem Cruise, a series of guest lectures on the various vistas of chemistry and related fields, of course. As our very first speaker, we are really honored to have Dr. Datta with us. Dr. Anindya Datta is a very busy and popular professor at IIT Bombay. So it's really our great fortune that he agreed to make time for us such a small students association as us. So yes, the Xavier's Association of Chemistry, ZAC, it's an all students club, although of course with great support from the faculty members of the chemistry department of St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. We are basically a bunch of curious undergrads trying in our own ways to popularize the chemical sciences. For us, science is not a destination or a goal that we're trying to achieve. It's more of an exploration, a constant adventure. And that's why the name Chem Cruise. This year is special because Zach is turning 18 years old. It's becoming an adult. So, to celebrate that, we have finally started our own website, the link to which you must have seen in the poster for this talk. So, for this session, there are a few very simple rules I would request everyone to keep in mind to have a more fulfilling time. Firstly, I request anyone not speaking to keep their microphone and camera off. If you have any questions, please save it till the end. Don't interrupt the talk unless it's absolutely necessary. At the end of the lecture, we shall have a question and answer session. Any doubts are welcome. Either type it in the chat box or you may use the raise hand button and unmute yourself. Personally, I would suggest everyone to not hesitate but to ask your doubts in the Q&A session because this is a very rare opportunity having such an eminent personality with us. So now let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Datta, the center of today's event. Although he is not someone who needs an introduction, I dare say most of you have already heard of him. As a researcher, he is one of the stalwarts in the country. Currently, the head of the Department of Chemistry at IIT Bombay, Dr. Datta's journey is fascinating for any student aiming to pursue research in chemistry. He's currently a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Physical Chemistry and has over 120 publications in peer-reviewed journals and 2 book chapters to his name, not to mention various awards and recognition. Most notable among these are the Bronze Medal by the Chemical Research Society of India, Award for Excellence in Teaching by IIT Bombay, the G.V. Bakore Memorial Award by the Indian Chemical Society, the Young Researcher Award by the Chemical Research Society of India, and the Young Investigator Award by IIT Bombay. But Dr. Datta is not only a reputed researcher, but also an outstanding teacher. So, for those of you who are interested to have a taste of his teaching, I would suggest you to enroll for the NPTEL courses which are available by him. There, I believe I've taken up too much time already. The audience is very impatient for your talk, sir. So without wasting any more time, let me hand over to Dr. Datta. Sir.
You're muted, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So this avatar of mine would better stay muted. So I'll keep that. Okay. So thank you very much for having thought of me to address you today, and thanks for coming over on a Saturday afternoon. I'm sure you have better things to do than to be listening to a talk on a Saturday afternoon. But then, well, this seemed to be a good time for everybody. So here we are. And one reason why I never say no to these lectures is that, when I studied in Presidency College, Calcutta. And when we were a student there, every Thursday, there used to be a seminar by eminent researchers, many of whom were alumni of the college. And the first such lecture that I heard as a first-year undergraduate student was by Professor Mihir Chaudhuri. And hearing this, I felt that I have to work with lasers. That was such a fascinating talk. Professor Mihir Chaudhuri was one of the most renowned teachers and researchers when we were students. Sometime in my second year BSc, there was another talk by one of his ex-students, Professor Kankan Bhattacharya. Hearing that talk, I decided that if I were to PhD, I have to do it with this country. And after several years, I did. So this is a kind of influence this kind of interaction can perhaps have on students. So that is why I think these are most important things that one can participate in. So that being said, I'm going to talk today about a little bit about our research. Let me hide this. Yes. And in one way, it is a very appropriate field to be discussing on a day that celebrates Raman effect. Because, you know, when Raman came up with his effect, that time there was no laser. And the experiments that he did were really phenomenal. To start with, he used condensed sunlight, and then he used some mercury lamp. But then the true implication of Raman effect became clear to everybody only many years later, after 1965, when lasers were invented. And Raman effect really is something that is used widely in spectroscopy. So that we also work in spectroscopy, that is connection, and we work in laser spectroscopy. So that way, this is perhaps appropriate in celebrating Raman effect as well. I'm going to talk about the ultra-fast chemistry of the ultra-small. Let me first start off defining what is ultra-fast and what is ultra-small. Well, ultra-small to me is anything to see which you have to look at it under some variety of microscope. Can be an optical microscope, can be an electron microscope. Depending on how small it is, you have to use different varieties. But roughly that is what an ultra-small is as far as I'm concerned. Of course, molecules are smaller than all these things. So all chemists work with things that are perhaps smaller than ultra-small. But as we get ahead, you'll see how it goes. One thing I wanted to ask is, Bonaviti or Madam, can you please tell me when I should stop?
So you can continue. Continue, it's going well.
No, I mean, now I will, but at what time should I stop eventually?
Yes, Bonaviti, tell please.
You are someone we will not try to stop at all.
Yes, actually.
All right.
Yes.
I'll try to stop myself no later than 5:15.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
After that, we'll have earned our cups of tea or whatever.
Okay.
And what is ultra fast? That is something that we want to discuss in a little more detail. And to go there, we start with very basic chemistry that all of us have studied, not only in our first year or second year undergraduate course, but also in class 11 and 12. That is chemical kinetics. All of us here, since we are chemists, all of us here are familiar with rate equations like this. Maybe I'll change it to a laser pointer. So all of us are familiar with rate laws. Minus dx dt equal to k into a minus x to the power n. And we know that if you can write an equation like this, a is of course the initial amount of a substance, x is the amount of the substance at time t after starting the reaction. If you can write it like this, then n is the order of the reaction, k is the rate constant. Right? This is something that we all know, I'm sure. We'll start from here. And we'll start from the question, how do we know, from which of these quantities do we know how fast the reaction proceeds? Well, we know it from the rate constant. The larger the rate constant is, faster is the reaction. Why do we study chemical kinetics? We study chemical kinetics because that is what allows us to propose mechanisms. Anybody who has studied organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry would know that one of the major goals in our study of chemistry is to figure out how reactions proceed, how different chemical processes proceed. And the only way to do that is to perform a study of chemical kinetics. Well, even after you do the study, you're not very sure about the mechanism always. You can only propose a possible mechanism. It is not word from God written on stone in letters of fire. But without chemical kinetics, you cannot even get that. So let us think of a reaction like this. H2 plus Br2 equal to 2HBr. Then looking at it, we might think that one molecule of H2 reacts with one molecule of Br2 to give us two molecules of HBr, very simple. But when we work out the rate law, it turns out to be quite complex. And that is what leads to the proposal of the mechanism that is actually involved in here. I do not have to say what mechanism is involved. I think you will know, right? And what we do is, with passage of time, we worry about how the reactant concentration decays, how the product concentration increases, what happened to an intermediate if there is one. And this is another equation that we all know, that is Arrhenius equation. The rate constant depends very much on temperature, as we know. K equal to A e to the power minus EA by RT. I'll not explain what these terms are to a class of students. You know very well. Now, I'll just skip on this. Let me just say that in this picture that we draw, we know that the activation energy is the energy difference between activated complex and reactants. And study of this leads to the field of molecular reaction dynamics. When you do that, and this is one equation that perhaps many of us will not recognize, but I hope that it is not an equation that will scare us either, right? So when we are in maybe third year undergraduate or first year postgraduate chemistry course, we are going to study this reaction. Okay, it's called Eyring reaction. So this is the theoretical description of rate constant from what is called activated complex theory. These Q's that you see, they are called partition coefficients. Q star is associated with the activated complex. QA, QB are partition coefficients associated with the reactants. And the word partition perhaps reminds you of something called equipartition of energy. There is a relation there, we'll not get into that. And e to the power minus E0 by RT, this is familiar to us. Now we ask the question, what can be the largest value of K? Largest value of K, remember, corresponds to the shortest amount of time associated with the reaction, the fastest reaction. So starting from Eyring equation, we ask, what can be the largest value of K and what it is? What is it? To do that, first part is very easy. Look at this exponential factor. What is the best possible scenario? The best possible scenario is that this EA equal to 0. There is no activation energy. So that way, K will have the maximum possible value, because if E0 equal to 0, then the exponential factor becomes equal to 1, and you are left with the rest of it. Since you have not studied it, most of you, let me just believe me when I say that the best possible scenario also is that this ratio Q star by QA QB is equal to 1. So this is equal to 1, this is equal to 1. So the largest value of small k, the rate constant, is KT by H, where this K is Boltzmann constant. I should have written it in a different way. And at room temperature, this roughly translates to a rate constant of 6 into 10 to the power 12 per second. So what we just said is that the fastest possible chemical reaction can take place with a rate constant of 6 into 10 to the power 12 per second. And in our field, it is conventional to use not the rate constant, but the time constant. Time constant here is just the reciprocal of the rate constant. That turns out to be 170 femtosecond. 1 femtosecond is 10 to the power minus 15 second. This is a typo that I never correct. I don't know why. This per second, of course, is wrong. It is just second. So this time constant is 170 femtosecond. Many times we call this time constant lifetime for a particular reason. So if I want to study the fastest of the chemical process, that will allow me to establish all the mechanisms in the world, then I should have a stop clock that allows me to make a measurement with a precision of at least femtoseconds. I should be able to record a time constant of 170 femtoseconds. Okay, this gave rise to the field of ultrafast dynamics, and this was given the name femtochemistry by Professor Ahmed Zewail, who got his Nobel Prize in chemistry for his work in femtochemistry in 1999. Now the question is, how do we follow such fast processes? If I want to know how much time it takes for me to go from here to Colaba, I mean, my watch is good enough. If I want to know how much time it takes for Usain Bolt to run 100 meters, then I need a good stopwatch. If I want to go down to femtosecond, then I have to have some kind of a stopwatch that has that kind of time resolution. Does such a stopwatch exist? Actually, it does. And this evolution of stopwatches is sort of like this. This famous arrow of time is adapted from the Nobel lecture of Professor Ahmed Zewail. As you see, with passage of time, the capability of mankind to measure shorter and shorter and shorter times has increased. And a lot of increase has taken place over the last maybe 50, 60, 70 years. As late as, say, 1920 to 1923 to 1940, we could measure only up to millisecond, a measurement that is required even to determine who has come first and who has come second in an Olympic sprint. To go from there to microsecond, we had to wait until 1949, 1953. Capability to measure nanosecond came only as late as 1960. Well, for many of you, 1960 might sound to be prehistoric, but it's not really so long ago. Measurements in picoseconds started in 1970, and finally, capability to measure femtosecond came in 1980, which still is perhaps much before all of you in the audience or students were born, but again, not such a long time ago. And let me just show you, without much of an explanation, of one of the pieces of data that got Professor Zewail his Nobel Prize. He took what he called snapshots of bond breaking. What is the fastest possible chemical process? Breaking of a bond, right? Nowadays, people measure in attosecond and go down and they talk about what they call state-to-state dynamics, but that is more of physics than of chemistry as far as I'm concerned. For me, breaking of a bond is the most fundamental chemical process that I need to worry about. And what Zewail did and got his Nobel Prize for is that he figured out not only the time it takes for a bond to break, but also he showed how the bond breaks. You see these curves. What it essentially says is you start with sodium iodide and you prepare free sodium from there. So you dissociate sodium from iodine. And sodium iodide actually partially exists in covalent form as well. So what he showed is that this free sodium, so you can think that this y-axis is population. So when sodium iodide is cleaved, free sodium population increases. How much time does it take for it to increase? It is almost complete in some picosecond. But even before that, you see there's an oscillation. What it means is that the sodium and iodine, they cannot just break apart from each other. This is what they do. They're together, then they try to break apart, but then they're pulled back together. Try to break apart again, pull back together. So in every iteration, they move a little further apart until they reach a time when the separation is so much that they cannot get back anymore. That is what this curve tells us. And what it opens up is that it opens up a whole new field of chemistry. All the chemistry, most of the chemistry that you study, except for one course, is about chemistry that takes place in ground state. You take a reactant, then you add something else, and the reaction takes place. All that is ground state reaction. What happens if I excite a molecule? I put in light and excite the molecule. That opens up the field of photochemistry. And I believe you do have courses in photochemistry later on in your curriculum. Is it esoteric? Is photochemistry something that goes on only in labs that nobody is bothered about? Not really. I mean, a lot of photochemistry is going around us all the time without us even noticing it. The first thing is, you can see me, I can see you. That process of vision itself involves a lot of photochemistry that goes on inside our eyes. Photosynthesis is another process that is of fundamental importance. Without photosynthesis, no life is possible in the form that we know it. That is all about photochemistry. And the reason why molecules can participate in reactions in presence of light that they cannot in its absence is that, I perform an excitation. I think you're familiar with molecular vitals. So let's say I have some molecule here. This is a HOMO, this is a LUMO, 2 electrons in HOMO, no electron in LUMO. Now I suppose I perform an excitation. So I can create the singlet state or the triplet state. Now see, electron configuration is different, right? From ground state to singlet excited state to triplet excited state. And as you know, reactivity is determined by electron configuration. So since light brings about a change in electron configuration, That is why it brings about a change in reactivity. And very often, excited molecules do things better. When we are excited about something, we usually do it better, unless we get so excited that we mess up with that. So even molecules work like that. When you excite them by shining light on them, they usually do things better. For example, an organic acid becomes a better acid usually when you shine light on it. And using this phenomenon, that molecules, acids become more strongly acidic, organic acids, this group of Nibbering and co-workers, as recently as 2005, and there's another paper in 2008, I think, they have established something that conventionally we have thought is undoable. All of us have studied that acid-base reactions take place so quickly that you cannot really talk about a mechanism of acid-base reaction. If I ask you what is the mechanism of bromination of alkene, you'll be able to tell me. Okay, Markovnikov addition, anti-Markovnikov addition, so many different elimination mechanisms are there. But I think we have all learned that acid-base reaction, well, it just takes place. So fast that you cannot talk about mechanism, no longer so. Not so for the last 15, 16 years. Using this property of acids becoming stronger acids in their excited state, Nibbering's group from Berlin would actually establish the mechanism of acid-base reaction. The mechanism might look very simplistic, especially since we have studied organic chemistry and we work with such big molecules, but this is of fundamental importance. Okay? So this is what your ultra-fast spectroscopy can do. It can give you answers that conventional chemistry cannot. We use mainly fluorescence techniques. Fluorescence means you shine light, and then light of a different wavelength comes out. Okay, I think you are going to study absorption fluorescence sometime or the other. Two kinds of experiments. One in which the excitation light is always on, that is called steady state fluorescence, and the other one in which we excite the molecule with a pulse of light. Pulse means a burst of light, right? Like this. And what it does is that it creates an excited state population. What happens when the light goes off? Does all the excited state population decay immediately? Not really. Here, I like to use a somewhat violent example. Suppose, think of a tight slap. The time of contact between the fingers and the cheek is really very small, but provided the slap is tight enough, even after the hand is removed and perhaps has gone to a different location, along with the rest of the body, the pain lingers for some time. It decays over time. Yeah, insult lingers for longer. That is what I like to use as an analogy for fluorescence and phosphorescence, but let that be the story for another day. It's sufficient if you understand that if you excite with a pulsed light, then we create an instantaneous population at this time, x-axis here is time, and then the excited state population decays, right? Usually, it's a first-order process. We have studied chemical kinetics. We know what is first-order process, second-order process. Usually, the simplest case scenario is a first-order process. So if you plot log of population of excited state against time, you get a straight line. Here, since you are monitoring fluorescence, fluorescence intensity is proportional to excited state population. So that also decays exponentially with time. Since I'm plotting log of intensity against time, you get a straight. Now, this is related to what is called emission quantum yield. Emission quantum yield tells you how strongly fluorescent your sample is. So relationship between emission quantum yield and, remember, tau is a time constant, reciprocal of rate constant. Here we call it lifetime, because it turns out that for single exponential decay, this is the average time spent by a molecule in the excited state. Okay, so longer the lifetime, usually stronger is the fluorescence. So if you have a slower decay, lifetime is longer and stronger emission. Now, what I've told you is the simplest case scenario, a single exponential decay. If all decays were single exponential, then things would have been very systematic, easy to explain, and therefore boring. But God is kind, and more often than not, decays are not single exponential. So even if you plot log of intensity against time, you don't get a straight line, you get a curve like this. And that is what we make a living out of. Now, how do you record this? So what is our job? Our job, and lab team, please get ready. Our job is to excite our samples, molecular material, by pulsed light. and to measure how quickly the fluorescence decay falls off with time. And remember, we want to do this measurement with accuracy of nanosecond, picosecond, femtosecond. So we need complicated equipment like this. So what I thought is, since we have this convenience that I'm making the presentation from my office, why don't I give you a walkthrough to my lab, and our PhD students and postdocs are there. They are going to give you a quick tour of the lab and what it looks like. They are here on another meeting, Google Meet. Okay, everybody ready? Videos on?
Yes.
All right. Now, just give me a sec. Here we go. Yeah. What you see now is you see videos from different labs that we have. We are going to go there one by one, and we'll show you what we have. Let us start with the lab where we can make measurements in with femtosecond time resolution. Here we are. And our PhD students, Hemen Gogoi and Shoradip Dasgupta, are going to give us a tour of this lab. Well, I'm going to do all the talking, but they are going to actually show us. So what you see here is this thing, this white box, the longish one. This is a femtosecond laser, a laser that gives out pulses of light of a duration of about 100 femtosecond. What you see here, the smaller white box, this is a pumped laser. What it does is that there is a titanium sapphire crystal in this big box. It excites the titanium sapphire crystal, and the emission of that is collected by lots of mirrors. Unfortunately, we are not going to open up the lid and show you. We could have done that, but our service engineer gets really unhappy with us if we do it. So we'll not do it today at least. So this is the laser that gives us your 100 femtosecond pulses, and it gives about 80 multiplied by 10 to the power 6 of those pulses per second. The repetition rate is 80 megahertz. Shoradip, can you hold a card in the path of the light and show us the light beam, and maybe switch off the room light so that we see better? Okay. So you see this spot of light? I'm seeing blue light. Yes. Now, unfortunately, you'll have to believe me when I say that this is actually red light, because the thing is, first of all, you're putting it on a card, and then we are using mobile phone cameras which have their own idiosyncrasies. So what looks like definitely a non-red light to you is actually red light. Just believe me on that. That's a spot of laser. That's a laser spot. Turn on the room light, please. Yeah, that is it. That is a laser light. This light goes in, and we focus it onto what is called a nonlinear crystal. This is the crystal here. Hold on, there's a lag, so go slow. And when we focus red light onto this nonlinear crystal, what happens is, so think of what happens if I have two droplets of water. I bring them together, they coalesce and form a bigger drop, right? Similarly, two red photons, you might remember that energy of a photon is h nu. So two red photons have smaller values of nu. When they join up, they give me a blue photon with a larger value of nu. And you can do the math. Two 800 nanometer photons, when they join up, what is the wavelength? Actually, it's going to be 400. So now, Shoradip is holding the card in the path of the blue light. I think blue is easier to see. So as you see, Shoradip, is it possible to detune the crystal and show how it falls off, or will that mess up things? So if you turn the crystal a little bit, then you see the intensity of blue light will go down. Yeah. It's burning. So what you just saw is the laser light is so intense that if you put it on a card which has black letters, then actually it burns. Okay, is the blue light optimized? Please hold a white card.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the blue light that we use. White card. Don't put the letters in the path of the laser. So this blue light is what we use to excite our samples. Now, initially you have a mixture of red and blue light even after the crystal. It goes and hits what is called a dichroic beam splitter. Can you show us the beam splitter? Yeah. So this beam splitter, you can see it's a little color, right? What it does is it transmits red light. Turn off your mic, please. Please mute yourselves. Okay. So this dichroic means two color. So this dichroic beam splitter reflects blue light and transmits red light. Can you show them the red light after the beam splitter? Why don't you use the other side of the card which has no letter? Yeah, so that is the red light going through, and show us the blue light now. Yeah, this is the blue light that we are going to use to excite the sample. Now show us the path of the blue light. Maybe turn on the lights now. Yeah, so the blue light comes here. It's let's not worry about that piece of optic. Show us the mirror. Hemen, walk back a little bit. This mirror, and then it is focused by this. Do you see the cylinder? Show us the lens. Go closer to the lens. Hold the camera steady. Yes. So what this cylinder that you see, it contains a convex lens which focuses this blue light onto our sample. Shows the sample. Right. So you see this green tinge. This is the fluorescence from the sample. So as you see, since we are exciting using an intense laser light, the fluorescence is so strong that we can see visibly. And we have to rotate the sample because otherwise, like that card was burning, the sample will also burn. So now what we do is we collect this fluorescence. Right here, we have a collecting lens. It goes straight, and this filter cuts out the blue light and allows the fluorescence light to go through. Here we have another lens. This lens focuses the fluorescence light, the green light in our sample, onto another one. This, you see this piece of optics here, right? This is the aluminum holder, and small piece of optic that's very precious. That little piece of glass is 50,000 rupees. Actually, more than that, 1 lakh rupees. So you focus it here. This is another nonlinear crystal, a crystal which allows two photons to join up and produce a photon of higher energy. So this is one arm, one side of the story. Now let us go back a little bit and show them the gate, path of the gate. Steady, steady, camera steady. It's very blurred right now. Hold it steady, please. Yes. Now we have gone back to the dichroic beam splitter. Remember what it does? It allows the red light to go through. The red light goes through, hits this mirror, comes here. What you see here is the back of another mirror, and that takes it to a retroreflector. Go back a little bit. So this cylinder, the black cylinder here, contains, you can think, two mirrors. So if light goes and hits one mirror, it goes to a second one and then comes back. So it retraces its path with a little bit of a spatial offset. And this retroreflector is mounted on a 1 foot long screw. Why screw? We'll come to that. And what we can do is that all this is governed by, used by a computer, controlled by a computer. Using the computer, we can move this back and forth. Shoradip, can you move the retroreflector back? So now he has given a command in the software, and you can see the retroreflector is moving back very, very slowly. Okay, why do we have to do all this? We have to do all this because, you know, there is no electronics in this world that can give you femtosecond time resolution. So the only hope we have is to use the power of speed of light to get that kind of resolution. So what you essentially do is, I will just go back to the presentation for a minute. Let's stop sharing this. I'll come back here. Just give me a second. So what we do is this. As you saw, here is your dichroic beam splitter. The red light goes straight. I'll call this gate light. Blue light comes here. What this blue light does is that it excites the sample and fluorescence comes out. This is one arm, and you put it on this nonlinear crystal. And this gate light has been made to be reflected by these two mirrors. Here's a mirror here, another mirror here, and it is focused onto the same nonlinear crystal. So see, suppose the frequency here is omega-1, and let us say the frequency of fluorescence light is omega-2, then what you do from this nonlinear crystal is that you get omega-1 plus omega-2. But then the story doesn't end there. The thing is, fluorescence decay is something like this, as we have discussed. This light here is something like this, a short pulse. So if the situation is like this, so I'm changing this path length, right? So if the path length traversed by this gate light is too large and it does not reach the nonlinear crystal in time, or suppose the path length is too small and it reaches the nonlinear crystal before fluorescence light even reaches it, then you will see no sound frequency generation. So if I plot intensity of omega-1 plus omega-2, I'm going to get 0. When the pulse is here, when the path lengths are matched, then you get very strong intensity of omega-1 plus omega-2. When it comes later, the intensity of the gate pulse is the same, but fluorescence intensity has decayed. So intensity of omega-1 plus omega-2 would have decayed proportionately. So that is what we plot. We plot the intensity of omega-1 plus omega-2 against delta, where delta is the length traversed by this, or the time required for the light to travel this path. Okay, so this is basically the principle of the instrument. That being said, we'll go back to the lab. Give me a second. Okay. Here we are. We're back to the lab, and we are seeing the same equipment whose schematics I had drawn a little while ago. Remember, this is the retroreflector mounted on a screw. This here is the nonlinear crystal. Now let us start recording data. And remember, what we are doing is, here we have the detector and monochromator. So we are choosing the frequency of omega-1 plus omega-2, and we are plotting its intensity against the time which is obtained by translation of this retroreflector, delta. We've started acquiring the data. And here again, you see, y-axis is what I told you, intensity of omega-1 plus omega-2, x-axis is time. And you see, this is 0 time. This is where the signal went up all of a sudden. Okay. So this is how the map of fluorescence decay will be generated with femtosecond time resolution. It will take some time. So what we'll do is we are going to go to another lab while this data acquisition goes on. Which lab will we go to now? Let us go to our time correlated single photon counting lab. Yeah. So what you see here is another laser. The laser I showed you earlier came to us in 2006. This one came in 2019. So the laser has become compact. Sorry for the quality of video. The laser has become more compact, but it's the same titanium sapphire laser that gives us 100 femtosecond pulses. But with this, the measurement that we do requires about picosecond time resolution. That's something we'll see very soon. Using this, once again, we generate blue light, and this blue light is fed into the spectrometer. Can we see the spectrometer? This is our time correlated single photon counting spectrometer. Now, I'm showing you an experiment where time resolution is poorer. You think that's bad? It's not bad, because you have to measure all kinds of times. It's not sufficient to do only ultra fast experiment. You need to do a little slower time scales as well if you are going to build a complete picture. All right. So this here is the spectrometer. Can you show us the detector? This is the detector, and this technique, we are not going into the detail of this today, but this involves a little bit of electronics as well as data analysis to understand. What we do is show us the sample chamber. This is where we put our sample, and can you show us the cuvette, please? Yeah. You see, this is a quartz cuvette in which we keep our sample. If it's a solution, we can also look at solid samples, put it in, the light is exciting it, put it in place. And then, is this computer screen shared, TCS/PC, or should I continue with this view? Yeah. So this is the data. This is what the data looks like. They have already recorded the data, and it got recorded very quickly. What you see in blue is the laser pulse as the instrument sees it. It's called instrument response function. And what you see in red is the fluorescence decay that we were talking about. Great. We'll come back to this lab, and we'll see how we can do the same experiment under the microscope. But let us see what is going on with our femtosecond experiment first. So in this time that we spent in the other lab, our femtosecond experiment has actually progressed quite a bit. So we are recording data point by point. Okay, this is experimental data. We're recording point by point. So Rudip, what is the full scale that we have right now? So this full scale here is 6 picosecond. And we see that fluorescence has decayed to some extent in this time scale also. If I go back to the other one, full scale in the other experiment, I'm sure you cannot read it, but I'll read it for you. Full scale here is 22 nanosecond. 1 nanosecond is 1000 picosecond. So using these two equipment, we have access to all kinds of dynamics that we need. Not only that, what we can do is we can couple this with a microscope. Now we are going to talk about what is called a fluorescence lifetime imaging microscope. You see this microscope here? This is a regular good quality fluorescence microscope. These are the eyepiece. What we do is we keep our sample here. Let us see the stage. Yeah. This is where we keep our sample. Now comes the ultra small part of it. We are looking at our sample under the microscope, and we are recording lifetime. Now, what you see up here is the lamp. That is something we don't need. That most of the time we don't need. Sometimes to see the gross position of the sample or something we might, but that's not very critical. The light sources that we use are in a different location. And can you show us the lasers, please? See this box? Inside this box, we have as many as 4 light sources, output of which are taken by an optical fiber. Show us the optical fiber. Here it is. Optical fiber into the microscope, and it goes in from the bottom. So you see this stage where we keep the sample, light goes in from the bottom. And fluorescence is collected from the bottom as well. Can you show us this light collection box? Yes. And these are the optics that are there. Well, most of the optics are hidden because we have so many pipes and all. But what you see, these are the 2 detectors that we have. Okay. So using this, what we can do is, now I'm going to share the screen of this instrument. Yeah, it is already shared with you. So we can measure things like this. You see this fluorescence decay that is recorded from one point under the microscope. This microscope has a special name. It is called a confocal microscope. So you can collect data from a particular point. Sharmisha, are we going to show them acquisition of data, acquisition of image? So now what we'll do is we'll quickly record an image, and we'll see what happens when we add the lifetime data. So now acquisition is going on. Can we turn off fluorescence lifetime weighting? I want to see a black and white image first. Yeah. So this is the intensity image. Okay. So that's what you see in a regular microscope. We have some fluorescent molecule, and our student Faryad has mixed it with a surfactant, and he has generated this very nice fibrillar structure, which has potential use in perhaps drug delivery and things like that. But if you use a regular microscope, this is the image that you'd get. You see the fibrils, and you see the fibrils with micron resolution, and this image is being recorded in front of your eyes as we speak. But we can do better because, see, look at this panel here, we are recording lifetime. Not only that, we are recording how the fluorescence intensity fluctuates with time. So if I don't like this, I want some more information, what I can do is I can do what is called lifetime weighting. That means I can ask the instrument to tell me which lifetime is observed in which portion of this image. And the moment we do that, we get something like this. Sharmisha, is it possible to zoom in? Is it at all possible to zoom in? So what you see here is not actual color. It is pseudo color. What is the meaning of pseudo color? Well, everybody in high school has seen an atlas. We have seen maps. And in maps, we see that the sea is blue and the mountains are brown and so on and so forth. These are not really colors of those features, right? Very often, color is used to denote height. Here also, color is being used to denote lifetime. The advantage is I can find out that in this region, what is the lifetime, in that region, what is the lifetime. And lifetimes, time constants, are very strongly dependent on your microenvironment, the immediate vicinity of the reporter molecule. So we can develop a very intricate understanding of complicated systems like this. Let us go back to our femtosecond experiment. It has gone a little more, you see. And we can see that whatever decay had to take place had taken place. There is an ultra-fast component, but there is a slower component as well. All right. So now what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll tell you a little bit about what kind of science we do using all this equipment. I'll request all the lab people to please stay there in the Google Meet, right? But next time we get back to you, train the camera on yourselves, not the equipment. Let's get back to the presentation. Here we are. Okay. This is what you just saw. Glimpses of our lab. And you might remember, this is time-correlated single photon counting machine. This is the femtosecond optical gating machine. And this is fluorescence lifetime imaging, in which we can generate. You see, these are images of pollen. They are not really so colored. This color is based on what kind of lifetime that is there. And what you see here is the inside of that box we showed you. These are our lasers, 4 lasers that are there. And it's a clever design that combines the output in such a way that a single optical fiber is sufficient to take them inside. And also you can combine these different colors and do more complex experiments. So let me quickly tell you of 2-3 kinds of experiments that we have done. One thing we have studied is ultrafast dynamics of nanotetrapods. We are all familiar with this shape. We love this shape, a tetrahedron. What we have made is we have made these nanoparticles. Nanoparticles means the size of this can vary. The width is typically 2 nanometer. The length can vary from 3-4 nanometer to even 100 nanometer. These have a myriad of uses. But what we wanted to see is, can we make nanotetrapods that are strongly emissive? And our initial attempts were all not very successful. So Faryad, who was there in the demo a little while ago, had done this work. He decided that he wants to dope these cadmium selenide nanocrystals with copper, small amounts of copper. So what copper does is that it acts as what is called a trap state. You're going to study some solid state chemistry, hopefully sometime in future. And there you will study perhaps about excitons and trapping and all that. So a little bit of copper disrupts the nanocrystal structure a little, acts as trap state, and leads to strong emission. And that is what we obtained as well. Here, what you see is fluorescence emission spectrum in absence of copper. Here, you see the spectrum is completely changed, much stronger and red shifted. The spectrum is in a lower energy, longer wavelength. That is what copper doping does. And using this femtosecond machine that you just saw, we figured out what is the time required for trapping. Because in absence of trapping, this is what the decay looks like. In presence of trapping, this is what it looks like. There's a faster decay, and with a little bit of use of a computer software, we find out that this faster component is associated with a time constant of 1 picosecond, which tells us that trapping process takes place with that kind of time constant. But once the trapping is done, then the trap lives for like hundreds of nanoseconds. That is why the intensity is so strong. Remember, intensity is proportional to lifetime. Another kind of experiments that we have done, and this has been done by our student, Tanuja Kistwal, and a student who has now graduated and is a lecturer in a college in Pune, Sucheta Banerjee. They did this experiment where they used this tetrapod, no copper this time, and they studied the interaction of tetrapod with protein. And they found that these tetrapods can disrupt the structure of protein and set this drug molecule. This is a molecule called warfarin. It can act as a drug, and it's also fluorescent, so it acts as a fluorescent marker as well. Now, warfarin binds very nicely to human serum albumin. This is a protein that we have in all our bodies, a carrier protein. So, this tetrapods are found to disrupt the structure of this protein and set the drug molecule free. How do we follow it? We follow it by you looking at the lifetimes. Drug molecule, when bound to this protein, has a long lifetime. So you can see the decay is slower. When it is displaced, it has a fast lifetime. So now you see this fast compound. So from here, we could nicely figure out that this displacement of drug indeed takes place by this nanotetrapods. So this is a summary of what the kind of work we have done in the field of nanoscience in the last 3-4 years. Another field that we are very highly interested in is solid-state organic photoimages. I promised to stop at 5:15. Now it is 5:02. We will stop in 30 minutes, maybe earlier. So, see, as you know, organic electronics is here. We do have televisions whose screens are made up of OLEDs, organic LEDs. And the good thing about organic electronics is that you can have this kind of flexible chips. You can have flexible keyboard. And this is no longer in science fiction, a flexible computer monitor or TV screen. When I was a kid, I actually, without knowing anything, I used to dream of making a TV screen that I could fold and put in my bag. Well, after I grew up, I never worked sufficiently to go to that direction, but then it is already there. So if you are going to work in the field of organic electronics, you need molecules that emit in solid state. And the problem with conventional fluorophores is that usually they're strongly fluorescent in solution, but in solids, something called aggregation post-quenching takes place, and they don't fluoresce so strongly. So we work with fluorogenic molecules, meaning molecules that in solution are not all that strongly emissive. They're flexible structure. And if a molecule is flexible, then once you excite it, this jiggling and wiggling motion of the molecules provides a lot of pathways in which the excited state can be deactivated without having to give out light. This is called non-radiative relaxation. And over the last 10 years or so, this field of aggregation-induced enhancement of emission has become very, very important because of its importance in organic electronics, and also because it allows you to think of something called bioimaging. You can see inside a cell using these things. So molecules that don't fluoresce in solution, but when you bring them together, make a crystal out of them, or add surfactant or add polymer and make aggregates of them, then they become strongly fluorescent even in solid state. That is the kind of molecules that we want to look at. So our initial work was done by an ex-student who's now a postdoc he's in Berlin now. So what he established was that he worked with a family of Schiff bases, and he established that if you can, so all the Schiff bases are very, they can move a lot. They're very flexible structure. He showed that if you can quench the motion, if you can stop these molecules from moving, then they become strongly emissive. And he achieved this by making complex of these molecules with copper or zinc, by adding some kind of small ethoxy or methoxy groups and making crystals out of them or incorporating them in solid matrices like polymers. Shorodip, the person, one of the people who was demonstrating the femtosecond experiment, has taken this work further, and he has established that in solids, if you have molecules that are pi stacked, then they don't fluoresce all that well. If you can somehow disrupt pi stacking and make it even like this, then you get strong fluorescence. And we have done all this by using these time-resolved fluorescence spectroscopic techniques. And the goal is to understand the conditions under which we can have molecules that would be good, strongly emissive systems in their solid state or aggregated state. So let me talk about one molecule. Unfortunately, I've not shown the structure here. We'll come to that later. We call it DBNPT. So what DBNPT does is that you can see the fluorescence intensity is so small, right? This is the fluorescence spectrum of DBNPT in solution. Not anything to write home about. Sorry for the awkward camera position. This is what DBNPT is when it is monomeric. When you add surfactant to it, and this work was done by a postdoc, Shomodip Rokit, who is now a postdoc in Toledo, Spain. So what he established was that when you add surfactant, then the fluorescence becomes stronger. And as you see, the decays also become slower and slower. And when we looked at it under an electron microscope, we found that nice nanorods are formed in their solid state. And these nanorods are actually such that you can see them under that fluorescence microscope also. Remember the fluorescence microscope we demonstrated, where we can record lifetime as well? We can actually see this there as well. And this is cryo-TEM image, which tells us that such structures actually exist in solution phase as well. So combining the technique of time-resolved fluorescence with microscopy, what we can do is we can follow this process of the aggregate forming very nicely. So what you see on the left-hand side are intensity images with some pseudo color. On what you see on the right-hand side are lifetime images. So you see, what we have plotted here is frequency of lifetime. X-axis is lifetime, Y-axis is frequency. So basically, you look at every pixel and you see how many times a particular lifetime occurs. So when surfactant is not there, then lifetime is around 1 nanosecond. As we add surfactant, what happens is, first of all, you see these rods being formed. Secondly, if you look at the lifetime distribution, in addition to this 1 nanosecond lifetime, you see something around 2 nanosecond coming up, and it's quite broad distribution. So these are marks of surfactant-induced aggregates being formed. As we keep increasing the amount of surfactant, these homoaggregates break up, and you see these surfactant-induced aggregates becoming more and more prominent. Also, you see there is a shift in the peak of this distribution. So lifetimes also become longer and longer. So along with morphology, we can see what kind of microenvironment is there using this fluorescence lifetime imaging microscopy. And another thing that Shomodip did is that he added another molecule there, perylene, and using something called energy transfer, well, we studied that using time-resolved spectroscopy as well, we could generate white light. And that is of fundamental importance because if you want to make LED, you want it to give out white light, right? So we hope that this system will become useful in future in applications for organic electronics. And this is the paper we published, and they liked the work so much that they wanted this figure on the cover of the journal issue. Another thing that Shomodip did, and this is the other one also, Shormishra was there. Shormishra is one of the students who demonstrated the FLIM machine to us a little while ago. We tried to do something similar using triblock copolymer. Triblock copolymers seem to be more promising than surfactants because they set by themselves, right? You make a solution, leave it, then it becomes solid. So we use two kinds of triblock copolymer. What you have here is that these in the core we have hydrophobic units of polymer. At the periphery we have hydrophilic units. So these are amphiphilic polymers. And the difference between the two polymers we took is that the hydrophilic units are different in number. This unit is different in number. The hydrophobic core is the same in both. And in both, we got significant increase in fluorescence intensity as well as lifetime. And when we looked at it under the microscope and we tried to look at lifetime, this is what we got. With P123, the first polymer, we got microspheres. And with the other one, F127, we got nanorods. I'll not go into the story of lifetime here, maybe, but suffice to say that, okay, this is the structure of the molecule that I should have shown you earlier. But then, when we compare it with the situation reported already in literature by Shomodipta himself, we see that these are things that happen only when the fluorescent molecule is there, fluorophore is there, or rather, fluorogenic molecule is there. In absence of the molecule, both the polymers form spherical aggregates, sort of spherical shell kind of aggregates, which are much smaller, nanometer size. Here we have micron size. So this interaction between the organic molecule and polymer is non-trivial in the morphology as well. And once again, using fluorescence lifetime imaging, we can see how the morphology evolves with addition of the polymers. And one small application that we have shown, this is only a cartoon because the cartoon looks better than the actual data. We showed that these one application that these tribloco-polymers has is in drug delivery. They are biocompatible. So these microspheres that we form, they cannot penetrate the cell wall, perhaps because they are too bulky and they're spherical. However, these nanorods, they are like needle, right? So they penetrate the cell wall and they can enter the cell and light up the cell cellular components that are there. We are planning to build up on this in a bigger way, and we are trying to see whether we can do intracellular imaging using lifetime, using this kind of a thing. Lab team, be ready for current call. So this is the conclusion. I don't need to run through that, but let me acknowledge all students, past and present, postdocs, collaborators, our institute, department, and funding agencies. And before I thank you for your patience, I'd like to do a curtain call, because all the students of ours, they have put in an effort to do this exhibition of our lab to you. So let me see if they're still there and if you can see them. All right. I'll share once again. Actually, they have decided to come together, and that is why I panicked a little bit seeing nobody on the screen. Here they are. Okay. In front, we see Hemen. Hemen works on gold nanoparticles, ultrafast dynamics. Behind him, you see Shorodip, whose data you saw a little bit, and they had demonstrated the ultrafast lab. Where are the others? We are unpinned. There. Okay, everybody is here now. Now you can see everyone.
So we can have a round of applause for all of them, all those who are present in the session. Thank you so much.
All right. So thank you, audience, for being there. Let me just finish the introduction. Here we have clinical videos. All right. Anyway, but I think you have seen all of them. That should be enough. Thank you, people, for being here, and thank you, audience, for being here as well. Thanks for your patience.
Yes, Bono Biti, please take
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for this really inspiring lecture. I mean, for the first time, I feel that we are lucky to have an online format more than an offline one, because we could never have got the lab tour without that.
That is right.
So now we are opening the question and answer session. Everyone can, whoever has a doubt, please type down in the chat box publicly, if possible. That would be better. I can reach out to sir and read out your questions. Or you could, of course, raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask. That's perfectly okay too.
Yes, all students, please.
Okay, I suppose everyone's gathering their doubts. In the meantime, I'll take the chance to ask my doubt. So I have I was like, while you were explaining all those instruments, there was one on the lifetime microscopy where you mentioned that we can't have ultra fast processes for all of them. That will be insufficient to gather the whole experiment. So we need some in the pico range, some in the femto range as well. And then you also showed us that timeline where the time range scale kept on getting smaller over time. So I was wondering that like, where does the future take us in this, possibly in the sense that is there a possibility we can go even less than femto on a auto or a zepto scale, and will that be beneficial in any way to understand reactions? uh, because as you said that all of this is quite encompassing and we need different range of sizes and timelines. So
Actually, you know what? The attosecond barrier is broken.
okay.
In fact, the attosecond barrier got broken sometime in 2003, if I remember correctly. So there, people, even in India, a few labs have started working using in the attosecond regime. That being said, what happens in attoseconds is state-to-state dynamics. Of course, chemists are interested in it, but the experiments are very, very demanding in all possible ways. The equipment that you saw, they actually cost crores of rupees. And if you want to go into attosecond, you can add at least 1 0 to that.
Yeah.
So that is one thing. The instrumentation is very, very challenging. And finding people who have the right kind of background to work on this is also difficult for a chemist. But it's not as if chemists are not doing. Chemists are doing it big time. I don't want to get into it at this stage of my career. I'm happy with femtosecond and picosecond, but there are people who are getting into it. The other thing, Bonamiti, is that even the barrier of, I said ultra small, right? So there also significant improvement has been done. In a sense, there is a limitation of microscope. If you use wavelength lambda, then you can focus it into a spot of no smaller than lambda by 2. That is the limitation. This is called Abbe limit, diffraction limit. Yes. You see, we are using visible light. So even if we use, say, 800 nanometer, half of that is 400 nanometers. So separation between two spots that we can measure is 400 nanometers. Cannot do any better. But 2014 Nobel Prize that went to 3 people, 2 of them were for what is called super resolution microscopy. Stefan Hell and Betzig devised 2 different ways of doing it. Again, it becomes instrumentationally, it becomes much more challenging. Betzig's method is a little different. So we have somebody in the next lab, Professor Arindam Chaudhary, who actually has started working. He's a single molecule spectroscopist, but he has started working on super resolution microscopy as well. And there are many others in India who have gone into that. So more than time, this space barrier has been handled much better in the Indian context. But yes, both are important. Smaller time, smaller space, both have a lot of interesting information.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for clarifying my doubt. We have some new questions in the chat box. Sayantan has said, so when we talk of too fast, as we know about uncertainty, and we are looking for application in drug delivery, but won't it increase the uncertainty in position of delivery?
No, they are 2 different things. When we talk about too fast, we are talking about excited state process, right? That is drug delivery is a different thing. So most of the time, what we do is we look at this excited state process either to trigger something or to observe something. All right. So drug delivery takes place at a very different time scale, and these 2 do not interfere at all.
Okay. I hope, Sayantan, your doubt.
Question.
Yeah.
So adding to Bonobiti's question, is it possible that we can measure in the future, obviously, that we can go to a time scale of Planck time?
What is Planck time?
So 10 is to minus 34 seconds.
So the way things are going, nothing we should say is impossible, but there is a limit that nature imposes on us. So beyond that, we cannot go. See, uncertainty principle is what you have learned. So that is something that we cannot break by building any instrument. So as of now, the capability is attosecond, which we did not believe would happen even maybe 30 years ago. So it is too premature to say whether we'll be able to get there, but I'm sure we'll do better than attosecond at least.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so we have Tanas here who is interested to know how long it takes to learn to handle these instruments that sir just showed
So
us.
typically in our lab, a student requires at least 6 months to be very confident about how to go about handling these things. And preparation is required. It's not enough to know how to handle the things. You should know the theory behind it. See, for example, we are talking about ultrafast laser. How do we produce a femtosecond pulse? That itself is a mysterious process, to be honest. So how do we do it? So to do that, one needs to study a lot. And in our chemistry MSc course, at least, it is just not there. I do teach sometimes a course on ultrafast processes for our PhD students, which some chemistry students take. I'll just share my screen with you once again. So if you search Anindya Datta ultrafast, you'll see this lecture series on ultrafast laser spectroscopy. I'd better mute this, otherwise. So you see there are 65 lectures in this series, and some of them, I'll just run you through the list at the beginning. That is me, but ignore that. So we start with very basics. Introduction, steady-state spectroscopy, spectrophotometer, how they work, how to record spectra, excited state processes, TCSPC that you saw. So if you want to know how TCSPC works, this is where we have discussed it. And a lot of other. Now here comes femtosecond fluorescence subconversion, what you just saw. So theory of that is actually discussed in this lecture. So once again, we go to that same kind of setup and we have discussed. So in case you're interested, you can see this if you want.
Okay, so we have one more question, this time from Shivang. He's asking why did, in the shapes that we examined in the fluorescence images, why are they only spheres and rods? And is there any specific reason no other shapes are observed?
We don't know yet. We are trying to collaborate with theoreticians to try and find out.
Another question from Sayantan again. Doesn't analyzing chemicals with high energy lasers fundamentally alter the configuration of the chemical as in the molecule?
Excellent question. Very often it does. Okay, sorry, the problem is I'm speaking from a different computer. So whenever I speak, you see my photograph and not me speaking. Oh, now it has come. Great.
Yeah.
Now you can forget about this. Yeah, that is much more comfortable. I think there is a ghost in my computer. Sometimes it works, sometimes it behaves strangely. So very often, you have to be very careful that you do not destroy your sample when you do the process, because you're putting a lot of energy into it in a small amount of time. So if you remember, when we showed you the femtosecond experiment, the sample was rotating. Why do we rotate it? So that the same molecule doesn't get hit by the laser spot too many times, actually more than once. That is what we do to ensure that we don't destroy the molecules. Even then, sometimes it goes bad. So you have to play around with the laser power level and different parameters to make sure it doesn't.
Anybody else? Any questions? I don't see any more coming in the chat box.
So whoever is interested to discuss more is more than welcome to maybe send me an email, and I'll be happy to interact with you. I'll write my email ID in the chat.
Yes, please, everybody. You can check out the YouTube videos Sir showed. I definitely will. They seemed really interesting. The topic has interested me a lot. And I think for third year students, right now, it's a very important, like at a very important juncture, we had this lecture because it's another field we could try thinking of getting into for our further studies. This was really very, very interesting, especially because it has so many applications. That seems somehow most important to me at the point that constructive applications, as Marisban sir said, especially in the medical field and drug delivery. It's really very, very interesting. Now, we have another question from Pranav Johar, who is asking us, are there any relativistic changes in the same sample used if the laser ends up affecting the sample?
No, not really. If you want to do those experiments, you have to use special conditions. In the conditions that we do, there are.
So should we close the question answer sessions and last call really, because anybody who has any questions, come forward and ask it, please. And then I will hand over to Gitansh for the vote of thanks. Any more questions? No, I suppose this is it at this point. So Gitansh, I'll request you to come forward with the vote of thanks. And obviously, as Dr. Datta gave his email ID, even if you do have, you guys, anyone has any problems later, you can obviously approach him. So Gitansh, I give over to you.
Thank you, Bonobiti. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Well, that was truly an amazing trip into the branch of chemistry with a brilliant presentation and a special lab tour of the major instruments used in this branch. It surely has ignited a flame of curiosity in all of us. I, Gitansh, on behalf of the Department of Chemistry, St. Xavier's College, and all the participants, would like to express our sincere gratitude for keeping us engaged throughout the lecture on ultrafast chemistry of the ultrasmall and sharing us small insights and valuable time. We are privileged to have benefited from your knowledge. Thank you so much.
Okay, so, and now finally, thank you everybody else too in the audience who have been with us all along. Because obviously without an audience, this fantastic trip would not have been possible. Thank you to each and every ZAC team member. And of course, all the faculty members who supported us in our small venture this time. Starting ZAC online was an idea that the pandemic brought up. I would ask all of you to keep an eye on our website because we are very soon coming up with the next lecture in this series of Chem Cruise. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Datta. I know how busy you are, and it's really an honor you can make time for us. Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure being here.
Thanks a lot, Professor Datta. It was really an insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. See you then. Bye.
Yes, sure.
Bye, bye.